We're very lucky to have with us live in the studios this morning Jess Sundin and Jerry Condon. Jess Sundin is a Minneapolis activist targeted by the FBI in raids on September 24th. She is a founding member of the Twin Cities-based Anti-War Committee. Her activism has focused on opposing the wars and occupations in Iraq and Afghanistan and opposing U.S. military aid to Colombia and Israel. She was a leading organizer of the anti-war marches at the 2008 Republican National Convention in St. Paul and is a proud member of ASME Local 3800 and the Freedom Road Socialist Organization. So let's start out with you, Jess. You were one of 14 people that had the FBI raid your home. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, it was 7 a.m. on a Friday, and I actually awoke to the sound of the FBI banging at my door. By the time I got downstairs, there were something like 8 federal agents beginning to fan out across my house and go through all my things. My partner and my daughter were awake when the federal agents arrived. They showed us a search warrant that said they were looking for evidence of material support to foreign terrorist organizations. Specifically, they were interested in Colombia and Palestine and organizations that I'm in here in the United States, like the Anti-War Committee. They went through every room, all of our belongings. They would open up a file folder and leaf through every single page. They took many boxes of my things with them when they left the house. Lots of papers, flyers for events, notes for meetings. They took financial records and checkbooks, computers, my cell phone and my passport, photographs, videotapes. And while the raid was happening, we were told that we weren't being detained, but they didn't want us to use the phone to call anyone to come over. I insisted on calling an attorney friend from the National Lawyers Guild, and he ended up getting the word out, and within about an hour of the raid beginning, people started showing up on my front lawn, friends and neighbors and community members who wanted to support me and my family. And it quickly became clear to me that the raid at my house was being carried out, similar raids were being carried out in other places at the same time. I had already seized my phone, but I could hear it ringing off the hook. And I could see actually the names, the caller ID, my friend Meredith Abbey and my friend McKelly and others trying to reach us. And when people started coming, I started to realize there were 5 raids happening at homes in Minneapolis. We later figured out there was also a search happening at the offices of the Anti-War Committee and searches happening in Chicago. There were more than 70 federal agents involved in these simultaneous raids that Friday morning. And at the same time, they were knocking on the doors of other people's houses where they didn't have search warrants, but delivering subpoenas to appear before a grand jury or just asking to talk with people, interview people about this case. And so at my house, they were there for about 4 or 5 hours. And as I said, they went through all our things. And, personal things too, like my grandfather's archives from he actually worked for Boeing as a young man, and they had his old records out, and we're going through those too. And they were most interested in anything about Palestine or Colombia, anything about anti-war activism, and anything with names. They took address books and sign-up sheets from events that I'd been at. And we didn't talk with them. They didn't ask us to talk. Well, they asked if we were interested in talking, and we right away said we wouldn't be talking to them. So they didn't ask us anything further. But at the end of the raid, they gave us these subpoenas, like those that were being delivered up to other homes, to appear before a grand jury in Chicago. The response to the raids was immediate and profound in the communities where we live, in Minneapolis and Chicago both. Like, that afternoon, we had a press conference on my front lawn, and nearly 100 people came and gathered on my front lawn, coworkers and friends and neighbors, but also activists from the anti-war movement and other movements. And the same thing was happening in Chicago. That night, we had a meeting at a church in South Minneapolis, and something like 250 people came that same day because we're all people with deep roots in our communities. People know us. They know us as community leaders, And as people who are truly interested in opposing our government's policies, that's not the same as supporting terrorism abroad. So the outpouring that we experienced in our own communities was then echoed the following week. There were demonstrations in I think it was 62 cities around the country supporting us. We called for demonstrations at FBI offices and federal buildings. And, from North Carolina to here in Seattle, New York, California, everywhere, people really came out to say no to this repression. We've received, I think it's more than 100 solidarity statements from organizations around the country. I'm a member of AFSCME, as you mentioned. My union was having a statewide convention the following, I think it was the next week, and a resolution was passed condemning the raids on our homes and condemning the grand jury. It was passed unanimously by Minnesota's AFSCME Council 5, which represents 45,000 state, county, and city employees in our state. And that resolution has been, it's been repeated in union after union across the country, and other community organizations. We've gotten solidarity statements from abroad, too. And all of that just means so much to us to know that we're not standing alone in the face of this. I think that it's terrible what happened, that the idea that the government come into your home and go through your things when there's no charges against you, no case against us, but they're investigating us, and they apparently have the right to look through all our things. And my property hasn't been returned. I don't know when it will be. And the grand jury looms over us. To talk, maybe the two things we could talk more about would be the case they're trying to make about material support and the grand juries. Material support there was a law banning material support to foreign groups. It was passed in 1996, and it was augmented after 9/11, along with the Patriot Act and other legislation. And this law, you'd think it was banning material support as opposed to verbal support, but it's very broad. And I think the government has been expanding how broadly it can be applied ever since the day it was passed. At this point, yes, you can't send money or weapons to groups abroad. I don't think that's new. That said, they've expanded it to cover humanitarian aid, to cover, there's a line in it about expert advice. So even communications and coordinated communications, like if you reprint statements of organizations abroad, all of that is now subject to review for possible prosecution. That's all support that the government has a problem with. And the way that a group gets on the list of foreign terrorist organizations is totally subjective. The fact is, in the 80s, both the ANC, the African National Congress, was on the list, and the FMLN in El Salvador were on the list. And those, they came off the list that, Nelson Mandela was considered a terrorist by our government till the day he was elected the president of South Africa. The FMLN is now the party in power in El Salvador. And so it's a subjective thing for our government. It's to satisfy political objectives in a given moment in time, not objective like a checklist of things you could do wrong and that could get you on this list. And there's not even a way to appeal being off the list. In fact, it's been said that if you and I were to try to lobby the government to remove an organization from the terrorist list, we might be subject to prosecution for material support of foreign terrorist organizations. So it's a law that is far-reaching. And of course, the idea that it can limit our rights to meet people abroad, to say our views on conflicts that our government is funding, or maybe even not involved in at all directly, it's really problematic. And so this is the case that this is the law that they're investigating us under. And a lot of people have been prosecuted under it already. There's a famous case of the Holy Land Foundation, which was an organization that funded charitable causes in the Palestinian territories. And they were brought up on charges of supporting Hamas, which is the elected government of the Palestinian people, but is viewed by our government as terrorists. And they weren't accused of funding armed operations or anything that we might think of as terrorism, but just giving humanitarian aid to charities affiliated with Hamas led to the indictments and actually convictions of a number of their leaders. And it's a terrible case. Some of their leaders were not only convicted of violating the material support law, but I'm going to now kind of move into the grand jury process, were imprisoned for contempt of court, refusing to testify against their political associates about the case, can land you in jail. And so that kind of gets me to the grand jury situation. 14 people received subpoenas to appear before a grand jury related to this case. And all of us have decided we don't wish to testify before the grand jury. We initially sent notice through our attorney to the prosecutor that we would be exercising our Fifth Amendment right not to testify. There's a lot of problems with the grand jury. As a process, I believe it's actually, I learned last night, it's been thrown out. It's not used in Washington state anymore, though many states still use it and the federal government still uses it. It is a process where the courtroom, there's no judge. It's run by a prosecutor. The prosecutor handpicks the jury without objections from another side because there's not other representation. If you appear before the grand jury, you don't know if you're a target of the investigation or a witness against your friends and associates. And because they don't tell you whether or not you're actually being interrogated based on a crime you may be suspected of, you don't have a right to have a lawyer with you. And so you're in the courtroom alone, and they can ask you anything they want. Hearsay is admissible. There's no one to object. They can even, for example, they could have testimony that they know is false that's given to the grand jury. They could have someone testify and say that they saw me at a conference in Bogota, Colombia, when the government may also have exonerating information like a flight roster that shows I was on a plane somewhere else that same time, and they don't have to present it. So the grand jury is a very unfair system, and the idea that they can ask anything and that it really turns it into a real fishing expedition, and it really places at jeopardy our broader movements. None of us want to, well, first of all, put our own necks on the line in this process, this judicial process that's so unfair. We don't want to name names of people we've worked with in this country and broaden the net of who might be caught up in this case. But most importantly, because many of us have done international solidarity work, we don't want to testify about who we've worked with from places like I've traveled to Colombia. Colombia is the top recipient of U.S. military aid in this hemisphere. And within that civil war, there's a situation where there's a human rights crisis. Every day, activists in Colombia, trade unionists, human rights activists, mothers of the disappeared, every day someone is imprisoned or assassinated in Colombia for their work for social change. And I've met some of those people, and I don't want to name their names. I don't want to identify their faces before a grand jury, before a prosecutor who is likely to share that information with authorities in Colombia that could carry out reprisals against them. In fact, it could be a death sentence for people I've met for me to identify them before the grand jury. So we're not going to testify. The problem is, you think you don't have to testify against yourself maybe because you hear that you have a right not to do that. But with the grand jury process, they can force you. And they do that through a process of imposing immunity. They say, well, we won't use any of the words that you say to prosecute you. Now, we might use the words that Jerry or Mike say in when we interview them to prosecute you. So we're not saying we're not going to prosecute you, but we won't use your words against you right away. And so, and because of that, you have to testify. We're going to force you, and if you still refuse, we're going to put you in jail. And people can serve months or even years for contempt of court for refusing to testify in these grand jury processes. And that's what we're facing. But I explain why it's so important to us. I have a 6-year-old. Most of us are parents. A lot of us have young children. Layla's one of the oldest of the kids. And it's not an easy choice, but it's something that's very important to us that we not put a noose around our own necks or the necks of others either. And so we've been working to build awareness about our case, to try to push back against this FBI repression that could certainly be visited on activists anywhere in the country at any time, but also to try to shut down this grand jury process. And the work that folks have been doing here in Seattle, and we're going to hear about that from Jerry in a minute, has been repeated in cities across the country. We have a national project that's come together, a national committee to stop FBI repression. And there's really a lot of hope in that. I believe that our best defense, our best chance of defending our right to dissent, our right to free speech, is to use it and to stand together. I don't stand much of a chance standing all by myself before a grand jury, but when I have hundreds or thousands of people behind me, it gives me a lot of strength and a real chance, a real sense of hope. So.
And both yourself and the other people who have been subpoenaed, obviously you're incurring a lot of legal fees, so people can support that?
Yeah, we'd love to receive people's contributions. We have a website, stopfbi.net, and on that website you can donate directly or send us something in the mail. Can make your donations directly to the Committee to Stop FBI Repression, or attorneys from the National Lawyers Guild can take tax-deductible donations addressed to the NLG Foundation. And again, all that information is available on our website.
Now, in addition to the raids that happened, there was also some people that were contacted, I know, at least on the West Coast. Can you briefly talk about that?
Sure. At the same time the raids were happening, there were, doors being knocked on. I know in the San Jose area, one activist there who helped us with our organizing against the march, the RNC in 2008. He was visited, asked if he would talk. He said, "I'm not talking." They said, "Well, then we'll talk to your neighbors." And he said, "Go ahead." And they did. They actually knocked on his neighbors' doors and asked him questions like, "Does he have meetings here at his house?" It was very intimidating for him. Another, a student from North Carolina, they knocked on his door and he wanted to leave, and they just kept haranguing him for like 20 minutes. He didn't want to talk to them, and he didn't talk to them. In Milwaukee, there were a student activist who was getting phone calls. She said she was getting something like 8 phone calls an hour from the FBI offices there. She finally took one call to say, "I'm not going to talk to you." After the raids happened and after the subpoenas were all distributed, the FBI proceeded to actually visit some more people. One of my dear friends who I've known for something like 12 years, they went to her workplace, and her supervisor called her from her desk and said, "There's someone here to see you." Brought her down to a conference room, and there were 2 FBI agents who wanted to interview her at work. They said to her, "We're here to talk." They asked her if she wanted to talk, and she said, "I'm not talking to you." They said, "Well, do you want to know why we're here?" And she said, "Well, yeah." And they said, "We're here to talk to you about Jess Sundin," that's me, and they named a few other people, and how they manipulate people, and how we think that they have manipulated you. So trying to plant this idea that, her friends couldn't be trusted and had personally, manipulated her. Another activist who visited, who had hosted a fundraising party for a solidarity trip to Palestine last summer, at her house, they said, "Well, there are people who say they're raising money for charitable reasons, but really they're funneling it to other things." And so, they're hoping, I think, to start to paint a picture of the activists who've been targeted directly as people who can't be trusted by our friends and our political allies. So far, that's fallen flat on deaf ears. We have deep roots in our communities. People know us. We've been doing anti-war and international solidarity activism and union activism for, at least a decade. That's like the shortest timeline. One of our folks is a great-grandma. She's been doing it for a long time. And it's really important for communities to stick together. One of the attorneys, an attorney I spoke with last night at an event here in Seattle, pointed out that you don't have to talk to an FBI agent if they come to your door or your workplace. You have no obligation to, and in fact, any lawyer would tell you you shouldn't. If you want to talk to them, you should get yourself a lawyer first. But anyone with, I think, an eye towards the broader movement and our needs shouldn't do that either. The fact is, any information, even if you think you've done nothing wrong, I don't think I've done anything wrong, but the idea that they could use the information that you might have in some way you don't even know, connecting this dot to that dot to the next, and somehow from something insignificant that you've said, connected with, 70 other people saying something insignificant, all of a sudden they can put together a series of unrelated facts and make a case against someone like they're trying to do against me and my friends in the Midwest. So don't talk when the agents knock.
So it sounds like they're feeding your friends disinformation to try and play them off of you.
They're trying, yeah.
All right. It sounded like after you guys took the fifth that they backed off on the subpoenas, and then I had heard as of last week that they were reinstituting those. Can you update us on what the situation is?
So the initial response from the prosecutor when our attorney said they're all going to plead the fifth was, okay, well, they don't need to come in this day, the first days we were called for, but we'll get back to you. And the prosecutor started getting back to us last week. And we know that, so we have 3 individuals who've had to get individual attorneys because their interests may conflict, so they can't share an attorney at the point where they're facing the testimony being ordered. So they're getting 3 individual attorneys. Their attorneys are going to be calling the federal prosecutor next week. And I think at that point we'll hear what dates they're getting called back for. And we're expecting it's most likely that this immunity is going to be imposed on them and that they'll be facing jail time. So that's my friends, Tracy, An, and Sarah. Now, Sarah's the great-grandma I mentioned. An was there when my daughter was born, and Tracy used to be my roommate. These are my friends, and they're all wonderful women and important activists in Minneapolis. They make huge contributions to our communities and certainly to their own families and friends. So it's painful for me to think about them possibly having to be jailed because they refuse to testify against me. But I understand it because I feel the same way. We really need people, though, to speak out. And so what we're going to be doing is putting out a call for actions around the country. As soon as we have word from the prosecutors about what they're going to be doing, and then on the dates that they're called back to appear. So there'll be kind of 2 days for actions, and I think there'll be actions around the country. People who can't come to protests should and can make phone calls. And again, we'll be advertising that through stopfbi.net. But I imagine the organizers here in Seattle have their own ways of getting the words out to the Seattle community directly.
Do you also have like an email listserv through your website so that if perchance people don't check the website every day, they could be notified on their cell phones or something?
We're not Twittering yet. I believe that if people sign the petition on our website, that they then get entered into sort of an announcement listserv. Though the actions would be happening in local places. And so I think the best thing would be to get connected with Seattle United Against FBI Repression.
With that, we're unfortunately out of time. I want to thank you both very much for coming and spending time with us this morning.
Thanks for having us.